On the night of December 25, 1776, a Hessian colonel named Johann Rall was playing cards at the home of a Trenton merchant when a courier arrived with an urgent message. A local loyalist had ridden through the cold to deliver it personally, a warning. George Washington's army was on the move. It might be crossing the river that very night. Rall took the note. He did not open it. He slid it into his coat pocket, returned to his cards, and kept playing. 12 hours later, George Washington's army descended on Trenton out of a blinding snowstorm and tore Rall's garrison apart before most of his men could even find their muskets. Rall himself was shot twice trying to rally his collapsing regiment. He was carried to his headquarters and died there that night. When they undressed his body, the note was still in his coat pocket, unopened, unread. That single unread piece of paper is as good a symbol as exists for the entire catastrophe Britain was about to suffer at Trenton, a war that, by the British government's own assumptions, should already have been over. An army that thought it had won. A general who couldn't be bothered to read the one message that would have saved his life and his command. Before we get to that snowstorm, let's talk about how an empire that had just chased George Washington out of New York City smashed his army at Long Island and captured nearly 3,000 of his men at Fort Washington. How that empire found itself, 10 days later, having lost the single most consequential battle of the entire war. If this kind of history pulls you in, the kind most people never got taught properly, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we get into it. There's a lot more like this coming. To understand why Trenton mattered so much, you have to understand exactly how bad things had gotten for the American cause by December 1776. The year had started with promise. Boston had been liberated in March. The Declaration of Independence had been signed in July. And then the British came for New York with the largest expeditionary force the Empire had ever assembled, over 30,000 British and Hessian troops, supported by the Royal Navy under the command of General William Howe. What followed was a string of defeats so consistent it bordered on humiliation. At the Battle of Long Island in August, Howe outflanked Washington's positions and routed the American army, which only escaped total destruction through a skillful nighttime evacuation across the East River. At Kip's Bay in September, British troops landed on Manhattan and scattered American defenders so completely that Washington himself reportedly rode among the fleeing men in a rage, trying to stop the collapse. The Americans managed a small morale-boosting win at Harlem Heights, but it changed nothing strategically. At White Plains in October, Washington's army was beaten again. And then, on November 16th, came the worst blow of all. Fort Washington, the last American position on Manhattan Island, fell to a combined British and Hessian assault. Nearly 3,000 American soldiers were captured in a single day, an entire garrison gone. 4 days later, Fort Lee across the Hudson fell as well. Washington's army, what remained of it, fled across New Jersey with General Charles Cornwallis in pursuit. By the time they crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in early December, Washington's command had shrunk from roughly 19,000 men at the start of the campaign to barely 5,000 fit for duty. Uniforms were in rags. Many men had no shoes and were leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Disease and desertion were taking a steady toll, and hanging over everything was a deadline. Most enlistments expired at the end of December. When the year turned, Washington's army might simply cease to exist, dissolved not by British bayonets, but by paperwork. The Continental Congress, fearing Philadelphia would fall next, fled to Baltimore. It was in this atmosphere of near-total despair that Thomas Paine, who had marched with the retreating army, wrote the opening lines of a pamphlet that would be read aloud to troops within weeks. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. General Howe, watching all of this from the comfort of winter quarters in New York, was confident the war was effectively decided. He reportedly told associates he needed only to wait for the Delaware to freeze solid, and then he could finish Washington once and for all. He went into winter quarters. He left a string of garrisons across New Jersey to hold what had been won, including roughly 1,500 Hessian troops at Trenton, under Colonel Johann Rall. Nobody in the British command structure thought there was anything left to worry about. The soldiers Britain had stationed in Trenton were not British at all. They were Hessians, professional German mercenaries from the Principality of Hesse-Kassel, rented to the British Crown by their ruling prince in exchange for substantial subsidies. They had a reputation, not entirely undeserved, for discipline and ferocity in battle. Many of the same men had fought at Long Island and White Plains, and they had earned a fearsome reputation among American troops. Their commander, Johann Rall, was a career soldier in his 50s who had fought across Europe in the War of the Austrian Succession, the Jacobite Rebellion, the 7 Years' War, and against the Ottomans in Russian service. He was experienced, brave under fire, and by most accounts personally courageous to the point of recklessness. He was also, by December 1776, thoroughly convinced that the American war was as good as won. Rall had reason for this confidence. His Hessians had won every engagement they'd fought that year. The American army across the river was, by every report reaching him, a starving, disintegrating rabble incapable of mounting a serious operation, let alone an offensive one, in the dead of a brutal New Jersey winter. When subordinate officers suggested fortifying the town, building earthworks, placing artillery in defensible positions, Rall dismissed the idea. Fortifications, he reportedly said, were for men who were afraid. His Hessians did not fortify. They drilled, they patrolled loosely, and as Christmas approached, they prepared to celebrate. What Rall did not fully appreciate was how much pressure his garrison had already been under. American militia companies operating out of the surrounding countryside had been harassing his outposts for weeks. Small raids, sniping, constant low-grade attrition that had worn his men down and kept them sleeping in their uniforms with their weapons close. He also did not appreciate the depth of George Washington's intelligence network. A local farmer and butcher named John Hunneman, who had cultivated a reputation among the Hessians as a loyalist sympathizer and occasional cattle supplier, had been quietly feeding information about Trenton's defenses directly back to Washington for weeks. By the time Washington made his decision, he likely knew more about the inside of Rall's garrison than Rall himself fully appreciated. On December 22nd, a spy reported to a British officer named General James Grant that Washington had convened a council of war, a sign that something was being planned. Grant passed a warning along to Rall: "Be on your guard." Rall, confident in his men and dismissive of the threat from an army he considered a beaten force, did not significantly change his dispositions. He went into Christmas with his garrison exactly as undefended as it had been all month. Washington's plan, when he finally settled on it after several councils of war, was audacious to the point of being reckless. He would cross the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night with roughly 2,400 men, march 10 miles through the New Jersey countryside in darkness, and fall on Trenton at dawn, before the town was awake, before the Hessians had any chance to organize a defense. It was, in the original design, a three-pronged operation. A second column under General James Ewing was supposed to cross south of Trenton and block the Hessian escape route across Sunpink Creek. A third column under Colonel John Cadwalader was supposed to cross further south and create a diversion against other Hessian and British positions. Neither of these supporting columns made it across the river. The ice was too thick in places and too thin in others, the current too treacherous, and both Ewing and Cadwalader judged the crossing impossible and called off their portions of the operation. Washington did not know this when his own column began crossing in the late afternoon of December 25th. He pressed forward regardless. What followed was one of the most physically punishing nights any army in the war would endure. As the troops and equipment were being ferried across in flat-bottomed Durham boats used for hauling iron ore and built for exactly this kind of difficult river work, a powerful nor'easter storm rolled in. Snow turned to sleet, then back to snow, driven nearly horizontal by gale-force winds. One soldier later wrote that it blew, in his words, a perfect hurricane. Men who could not swim huddled in open boats as ice floes the size of small rooms collided with the hulls. Somehow, against every reasonable expectation, the crossing succeeded without losing a single man to the river, though getting the artillery and the half-frozen horses across took until nearly 3 in the morning, hours behind Washington's original schedule. By the time the entire force had assembled on the New Jersey shore, it was well past midnight, and the planned pre-dawn surprise attack was now going to happen in broad daylight, if it happened at all. Washington considered briefly calling off the entire operation. He decided to press on anyway. Before the army moved out, he had reportedly been seen with a note in his own hand bearing 2 words that would serve as the password for the operation that night: victory or death. The army split into 2 columns and began the 10-mile march through the storm toward Trenton. Men's muskets were wet, their powder at risk of being ruined, their feet, for those without proper boots, leaving bloody tracks in the snow. 2 soldiers died during the approach march, not from combat, but from exposure to the cold. They reached the outskirts of Trenton at around 8 in the morning. The Hessian garrison at Trenton had spent Christmas night exactly as Rawle intended, relaxed, comfortable, and unprepared. There had been a Christmas gathering at the home of Trenton merchant Abraham Hunt, where officers including Rawle himself had eaten, drunk, and played cards late into the night. When the first American shots rang out shortly after 8 in the morning, the Hessians initially assumed it was just another minor militia skirmish, the kind of harassing fire they'd grown almost numb to over the preceding weeks. They had no idea that the entire core of Washington's army had descended on them simultaneously from 2 directions, with General Nathanael Greene's column coming in from the north and General John Sullivan's column moving in along the river road to cut off any retreat toward Bordentown. What followed was less a battle than a rapid, methodical collapse. American artillery, set up at the head of Trenton's main streets, raked the town with grapeshot before the Hessians could properly form their lines. Hessian soldiers stumbling out of their quarters into the storm found American infantry already moving through the streets toward them. Attempts to organize a counterattack or an orderly retreat fell apart under the weight of confusion, the freezing weather, and the sheer speed of the American assault. Colonel Rawle, woken from his Christmas night sleep into a battle his own complacency had made possible, did manage to get mounted and tried to rally his men into a countercharge. It briefly worked. A Hessian advance pushed back into the town's main streets. Then Washington's artillery and infantry fire shredded the formation. Rawle was struck twice in the side. He was carried from his horse to a nearby church, then to the headquarters where he had been staying, and where he would die that night, the unread warning note still folded in his pocket. Before he died, he asked Washington, through an interpreter, for assurance that his captured men would be treated with humanity. Washington gave his word and largely kept it. Within roughly 45 minutes of the first shots, the bulk of the Hessian garrison had been surrounded in an open field at the edge of town with no path of retreat and no way to form an effective defense. They surrendered. The numbers, when they were finally tallied, were almost too lopsided to be believed. Of approximately 1,500 Hessian troops in Trenton that morning, roughly 22 were killed, somewhere around 90 wounded, and close to 900 captured, nearly 2/3 of the entire garrison taken prisoner in a single hour of fighting. American casualties were almost non-existent, a handful of wounded and the 2 men who had died of exposure during the night march, but not a single American killed in the actual fighting. Washington had crossed an ice-choked river in a hurricane, marched his exhausted, half-frozen army 10 miles through the night, and destroyed an entire enemy garrison without losing a man in combat. On paper, Trenton was a small battle. A few thousand men on each side fought in under an hour in a town most people in London couldn't have located on a map. By the standards of the great set-piece battles of the 18th century, it barely registers. And yet British strategists understood almost immediately that something much larger than a single garrison had been lost that morning. What Britain had actually lost at Trenton was the assumption the entire war had been built on, that the American rebellion was a dying ember that simply needed to be allowed to burn out. Howe had genuinely believed, with good reason given the events of the preceding months, that one more cold winter would finish the job without further bloodshed. Trenton shattered that belief completely. An army that London had been told was on the verge of dissolution had instead executed one of the most audacious and successful surprise attacks of the entire 18th century against professional European soldiers in conditions that should have made the operation impossible. The practical military consequences cascaded quickly. Cornwallis, who had been preparing to sail home to England for the winter, having been told by Howe that the campaign was effectively finished, was instead ordered to turn around and march back into New Jersey to deal with the resurgent American threat. Washington, in the days following Trenton, recrossed the Delaware again and won another sharp engagement at Princeton on January 3, 1777, slipping past Cornwallis's larger force in a night march that further compounded British embarrassment. By the time the dust settled, the British had been pushed almost entirely out of New Jersey, retreating to a small handful of fortified positions near New York, abandoning the strategic gains of the entire 1776 campaign. Here's something worth pausing on before we move to the bigger picture. If you've been enjoying the level of detail in this story, the kind of granular, accurate history that most channels skip past, drop a comment letting me know and consider subscribing if you haven't. It genuinely helps decide what gets researched next. But the deeper consequence of Trenton was about morale and survival, not territory. Washington's army had been on the verge of simply ceasing to exist at the end of December 1776, not through defeat in battle, but through the quiet administrative death of expiring enlistments. Soldiers who had been ready to walk home, having endured a year of constant defeat, instead chose to stay. Washington, in the days after Trenton, personally appealed to his veteran soldiers to extend their service for 6 more weeks, offering a cash bounty out of funds he had to personally guarantee. Many of them agreed, not because of the money, historians generally agree, but because for the first time in months, they had proof that this war could actually be won. News of the victory rippled outward and reshaped recruitment for the following year. Men who had been sitting on the fence, unwilling to commit to a cause that looked doomed, began enlisting. The Continental Congress, which had fled to Baltimore in near-panic weeks earlier, found renewed confidence in Washington's leadership, confidence that had been seriously in question after the disasters in New York. The consequences of Trenton did not stop at the borders of New Jersey. In Paris, where Benjamin Franklin had been quietly working to convince the French court that the American cause was worth secretly funding, and eventually openly backing, the news from Trenton mattered enormously. France had been watching the catastrophic 1776 campaign in New York with the same conclusion the British had reached, that the rebellion was likely to collapse on its own, and any French support risked being wasted on a doomed venture. A revolution that could be crushed by one determined winter campaign was not worth the risk of provoking British retaliation. Trenton, followed quickly by Princeton, complicated that calculation. It demonstrated that the Continental Army, even after a year of near-total defeat, retained the discipline, audacity, and capability to win sharp tactical victories against professional European troops under brutal conditions. It was not, by itself, enough to bring France into the war openly. That would take the much larger and more decisive American victory at Saratoga in late 1777. But it kept the door open. It gave Franklin and the American commissioners in Paris a concrete, recent example of American resilience to point to, at exactly the moment when French confidence in the cause was at its most fragile. Without Trenton, there is a real possibility that French support, quiet weapons shipments, gunpowder, money funneled through front companies, dries up before Saratoga ever has the chance to happen. Without that continued French support sustaining the Continental Army through 1777, there may be no Continental Army left standing to win at Saratoga at all. Howe, for his part, never fully recovered his earlier confidence after Trenton. He had told his superiors in London the war was essentially won. He now had to explain how a starving, dissolving rebel army had destroyed an entire garrison of his most reliable mercenary troops, forced a strategic retreat across an entire colony, and somehow turned the narrative of the war on its head in the span of about a week. The criticism that followed him for the rest of his command, excessive caution, a reluctance to finish what he started, an inability to press his advantages, traces directly back to the credibility he lost in the aftermath of that Christmas night. There is a particular kind of irony sitting at the center of this story, and it's worth sitting with before we close. Johann Rall was not a coward, and he was not a fool in any general sense. He was an experienced, battle-tested professional soldier who had spent more than 3 decades in uniform across multiple European wars. What killed him, and what cost Britain so much more than a single garrison, was something much more ordinary than cowardice or incompetence: certainty. The unshakable conviction that the war was already decided, that the enemy in front of him was beneath serious concern, and that a piece of paper handed to him at a card table on Christmas night could safely wait until morning. It couldn't. Washington's gamble at Trenton worked precisely because it should not have. No professional military mind in December 1776, American or British, would have predicted that a starving, half-dissolved army with expiring enlistments would attempt an opposed river crossing in a winter hurricane, march 10 miles through the night, and successfully destroy a garrison of professional mercenaries before breakfast. That impossibility was the entire point. Washington understood correctly that his only path to victory ran directly through the gap between what was reasonable and what his enemy assumed he was capable of. The British Empire did not lose the American Revolutionary War at Trenton. The war had years left to run and far larger battles still to come. But Britain lost something at Trenton that it never fully got back: the certainty that this rebellion was a problem that would solve itself. The note in Johann Rall's pocket, folded, unread, carried into his own death, stands as a fairly precise symbol for everything the British High Command refused to take seriously until it was already too late to matter. If you made it this far, you already know what kind of History Channel this is. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me which moment in this story you think actually changed the war: the unread note, the storm on the river, or Howe's decision to assume the whole thing was already over, and I'll see you in the next one.